You're standing at a security checkpoint, holding legitimate military identification, only to have a guard look at you with complete disdain and declare your ID obviously fake. The humiliation burns as other people in line start staring, whispering, and some even pulling out their phones. You try to explain, but the guard's mind is made up. Then, just when you think the situation couldn't get any worse, footsteps echo behind you, and suddenly everyone in the room snaps to attention. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had served her country with distinction for over 15 years. She'd commanded troops in 2 overseas deployments, earned multiple commendations, and had recently been selected for a prestigious assignment at the Pentagon. But on this particular Tuesday morning in September, none of that seemed to matter as she stood facing a security guard, who was treating her like a common criminal. The day had started normally enough. Sarah had awakened at 0500 hours, as was her routine, in her modest apartment just outside Washington, D.C. She'd completed her morning workout, showered, and carefully pressed her dress blue uniform. Today was important. She was scheduled to meet with senior officials about a new joint operations initiative that could reshape how different military branches coordinated their efforts. It was the kind of assignment that could define the next phase of her career. Sarah had always been meticulous about her appearance and bearing. At 5'6" with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of leadership. Her uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and insignia placed with precision. She'd learned early in her career that attention to detail wasn't just military doctrine, it was survival. But as she approached the main security checkpoint at the PAFAS federal building where her meeting was scheduled, Sarah noticed something in the guard's expression that made her stomach tighten. The man behind the bulletproof glass was large, probably in his 40s, with the kind of swagger that suggested he enjoyed the small amount of authority his position provided. His name tag read Thompson, and when Sarah slid her military ID through the slot, she watched his face transform from boredom to suspicion. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some real identification," Thompson said, pushing the ID back toward her with obvious disdain. Sarah blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Excuse me? This ID," Thompson said, holding it up and examining it like it was a child's crayon drawing, "is clearly fake. I've seen plenty of military IDs, and this doesn't look right." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In 15 years of service, no one had ever questioned the legitimacy of her identification. She'd used this same ID countless times at military installations, federal buildings, and secure facilities around the world. It had been issued by the Department of Defense, carried the proper holograms and security features, and bore her official photograph and information. "Sir, I assure you that ID is completely legitimate," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, and I have a scheduled meeting." "Look, lady," Thompson interrupted, his voice loud enough that other people in the lobby began to turn and stare. "I don't know where you got this thing made, but it's not fooling anybody. The photo looks doctored, the information doesn't align properly, and frankly, you don't look like military material to me." The last comment landed like a slap. Sarah felt the familiar sting of discrimination that she'd encountered throughout her career, the assumption that because she was a woman, and specifically a Latina woman, she couldn't possibly hold a position of authority in the military. She'd worked twice as hard as many of her male counterparts, had proven herself in combat situations, and had earned every promotion through merit and dedication. Yet here she was, being dismissed by a civilian security guard who apparently thought he could determine someone's military credentials by looking at them. "Sir, I need you to run this ID through your system," Sarah said, her military training helping her maintain composure even as anger built inside her. You'll find that it's completely valid. Thompson shook his head with exaggerated patience, like he was dealing with a particularly slow child. Ma'am, I don't need to run anything through any system. I can spot a fake from 50 feet away, and this, he waved the ID dismissively, is about as fake as they come. Now I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I call the authorities. The lobby, which had been filled with the usual morning bustle of federal employees and contractors heading to work, had grown noticeably quieter. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, could hear the whispered conversation starting to spread. Someone behind her was definitely recording with their phone. She could hear the subtle electronic beep that indicated video recording had started. This was exactly the kind of situation that could derail a military career. In an age of social media and viral videos, an incident like this could be twisted, taken out of context, and spread across the internet within hours. Sarah knew that even if she was completely vindicated, the damage to her reputation and career prospects could be irreversible, but she also knew that backing down wasn't an option. Not just for her own sake, but for every service member who might face similar discrimination in the future. The tension in the federal building lobby was thick, enough to cut with a knife. Sarah Martinez stood her ground, acutely aware that this confrontation was spiraling beyond a simple misunderstanding into something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The security guard, Thompson, seemed to be enjoying his moment of authority, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his career. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the checkpoint, Thompson announced loudly, his voice carrying across the now quiet lobby. And I'll need to confiscate this fake identification as evidence. Sarah's jaw tightened. In all her years of service, including deployments in hostile territories where her life was literally on the line, she'd rarely felt as frustrated and powerless as she did at this moment. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd faced down armed insurgents with more composure than this civilian security guard was showing her. Sir, you cannot confiscate my military identification, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. That ID is property of the United States Department of Defense, and removing it from my possession without proper authority would be theft of government property. Thompson's face flushed red at being challenged. Are you threatening me? Because I can have you arrested for that too, along with the fake ID charges. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Federal employees who were trying to get through security for their own meetings stood watching the drama unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing that something was very wrong with how the situation was being handled. Others seemed fascinated by the confrontation, their phones discreetly recording what was happening. Sarah noticed a few faces in the crowd that suggested not everyone was buying Thompson's assessment. There was an older gentleman in a business suit whose posture and bearing screamed military even in civilian clothes. A younger woman in professional attire had the kind of precise movements that suggested law enforcement or military background. These people recognized something that Thompson was too arrogant or inexperienced to see. I'm not threatening anyone, Sarah replied evenly. I'm simply informing you of the legal facts regarding military identification. Now, I strongly suggest you contact your supervisor and have them verify my credentials through proper channels. Thompson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the lobby. My supervisor? Lady, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know a fake ID when I see one, and I know a wannabe when I see one. You probably bought that uniform at a surplus store and had somebody make you an ID to try to get veteran discounts or something. The accusation was so outrageous, so far from the truth, that Sarah actually felt a moment of disbelief. This man was essentially accusing her of stolen valor, one of the most serious offenses a service member could face, and an insult that cut to the very core of military honor. "Sir, I am going to give you one final opportunity to handle this professionally," Sarah said, her voice dropping to the tone she'd used when addressing insubordinate soldiers. "Call your supervisor, run my ID through your verification system, or contact the Department of Defense directly. What you will not do is continue to make baseless accusations about my service or my character." But Thompson was too far down the path of his own arrogance to back down now. He'd made his judgment in front of witnesses, and admitting he was wrong would mean losing face. In his mind, he was the authority here, and this woman, regardless of what her ID said, was challenging that authority. "That's it," Thompson declared. Reaching for his radio, "Security to the main lobby. I need assistance with an individual attempting to gain unauthorized access with fraudulent military identification." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, drawing on every technique she'd learned for staying calm under pressure. She thought about her soldiers, the men and women who had served under her command and trusted her to lead them through impossible situations. She thought about her parents, immigrants who had sacrificed everything so their daughter could have opportunities they'd never dreamed of. She thought about every barrier she'd overcome, every challenge she'd faced. To earn her place in the military, she would not be intimidated by a civilian security guard on a power trip. When she opened her eyes, Sarah's gaze was steady and unflinching. "Sir, you are making a serious mistake. When this situation is resolved and my identity is confirmed, I strongly advise you to consider how you want to explain your actions to your superiors." Thompson was about to respond when the sound of multiple footsteps echoed from the elevator bank. Sarah turned to see two additional security guards approaching, both looking uncertain about what they were walking into. Behind them, she noticed, several more people were emerging from the elevator's men, and women in business attire who moved with the distinctive bearing of military personnel. "What's the situation, Thompson?" asked the senior of the two approaching guards, a woman whose name tag read Johnson. Thompson puffed up with self-importance. "We have an individual here attempting to gain access with fraudulent military identification. She's been hostile and uncooperative when confronted with the obvious forgery." Johnson looked at Sarah, taking in her perfect uniform, her military bearing, and the professional way she was handling what was clearly a stressful situation. Something in the woman's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Thompson's assessment. "Ma'am, may I see the identification in question?" Johnson asked politely. Sarah handed over her ID, noting the significant difference in how Johnson examined it compared to Thompson's cursory dismissal. Johnson studied the ID carefully, checking the security features, the photo alignment, and the official seals. "Thompson," Johnson said slowly, "this ID appears to have all the proper security features. Have you run it through the verification system?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "I don't need to run it through the system. It's obviously fake." "Actually," Johnson replied, "protocol requires that we verify all questionable identification through proper channels before making any accusations." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the main entrance doors opening. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of military footsteps, precise, measured, and confident. She turned toward the sound, as did everyone else in the lobby. What happened next would change everything. The main entrance doors of the federal building swung open with a decisive whoosh, and the entire atmosphere in the lobby shifted in an instant. The sound of approaching footsteps wasn't just confident, it carried the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Sarah Martinez, still standing at the security checkpoint with her military ID in dispute, felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Those weren't just any military footsteps. Thompson, the security guard who had been so certain of his authority moments before, was about to learn a lesson in military hierarchy that he would never forget. The figure who entered the lobby was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with senior military leadership. General Robert Harrison was a four-star general with over 30 years of distinguished service. At 62, he carried himself with the kind of presence that commanded respect from world leaders and adversaries alike. His dress blue uniform was adorned with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career spanning multiple conflicts, peacekeeping missions, and strategic victories. But more than his impressive credentials, it was his reputation for fairness, integrity, and absolute intolerance for discrimination that made him both feared and revered throughout the military community. General Harrison wasn't supposed to be at this building today. His schedule had been changed at the last minute when a critical briefing was moved up, requiring him to attend a meeting that would normally have been handled by subordinates. It was one of those bureaucratic adjustments that happen constantly in military life, but in this case, it was about to prove providential. As the general stepped into the lobby, his experienced eyes immediately assessed the situation. He saw the crowd gathered around the security checkpoint, the tension in the air, and most importantly, he saw Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez standing at the center of what was clearly a confrontation. General Harrison had an excellent memory for the officers under his command, and he recognized Sarah immediately. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any officer to General Harrison. 6 months earlier, she had been personally selected by the general for a classified joint operations project that had required the highest security clearance and absolute trust. Her work on that project had been exceptional, the kind of strategic thinking and operational excellence that marked an officer destined for senior leadership. The general had even made a mental note to ensure that Sarah was considered for accelerated promotion opportunities. So when General Harrison saw Sarah standing in what appeared to be a confrontational situation with building security, his first instinct was concern for one of his most promising officers. As he approached the group, he began to piece together what was happening from the fragments of conversation he could hear. Obviously fraudulent identification. DOES, and look like military material. Double quotes. Need to call the authorities. General Harrison's expression darkened. In his 3 decades of service, he had seen too many instances of good officers being subjected to discrimination and prejudice. He had made it a personal mission to ensure that such behavior was not tolerated in the environment where he had influence. The crowd around the security checkpoint was so focused on the drama unfolding between Sarah and Thompson that they didn't immediately notice the general's approach. It wasn't until he was within 10 feet of the group that his presence began to register. The first person to notice was Johnson, the female security guard who had been trying to handle the situation more professionally than her colleague. Her eyes widened as she recognized the 4 stars on the approaching officer's uniform. In the federal building environment, she had seen plenty of senior military officials, but a 4-star general was rare and unmistakable. "Attention," Johnson called out instinctively, her voice carrying across the lobby. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every person in the lobby who had any military background or experience snapped to attention. Federal employees who were retired military found themselves unconsciously straightening their postures. Even civilians who had never served could sense that someone of extraordinary authority had entered the space. Sarah, despite being in the middle of her confrontation with Thompson, immediately turned and came to attention. Her military training was so ingrained that it overrode everything else happening around her. When she saw General Harrison approaching, her eyes widened slightly, but her bearing remained perfect. Thompson, however, was completely oblivious. He was so focused on what he perceived as his moment of authority that he didn't understand why. Everyone around him had suddenly changed their behavior. He was still holding Sarah's military ID and was preparing to continue his accusations when General Harrison stepped directly into the confrontation. "Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, General," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. What exactly is the nature of this situation? The sound of the general addressing Sarah by her proper rank and name hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Thompson's face went from flushed red to pale white in the span of seconds as the implications began to sink in. Johnson, the other security guard, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The civilians who had been recording with their phones suddenly realized they might have captured something much more significant than they had anticipated. Sarah, maintaining her position of attention, replied with military precision, "Sir, I am attempting to enter the building for a scheduled meeting, but building security has declared my military identification to be fraudulent and is refusing to allow me access." General Harrison's eyes moved to Thompson, who was still holding Sarah's ID, but now looked like he was experiencing the worst moment of his professional life. The general's expression was unreadable, but anyone with military experience could sense the controlled fury building behind his calm exterior. "You," General Harrison said, addressing Thompson directly, "are holding the identification of one of my most trusted officers. An officer who holds security clearances that you couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. An officer who has served her country with distinction in multiple theaters of operation and has earned every commendation and rank she holds through merit and sacrifice." Thompson's hand began to shake as he continued to hold Sarah's ID. The general continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Now, I'm going to give you exactly 10 seconds to return Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's identification, apologize for your unprofessional conduct, and step aside so that she can proceed to her meeting. Because the alternative explaining to your superiors, my superiors, and potentially a congressional oversight committee why you chose to discriminate against a decorated military officer is not something you want to experience." The lobby was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. Thompson's career was about to change forever, and everyone in the room knew it. The 10 seconds that General Harrison had given Thompson felt like an eternity to everyone in the federal building. Lobby. The security guard stood frozen, Sarah's military ID trembling in his hand, as the full weight of his catastrophic mistake began to settle over him. The silence was so complete that the building's air conditioning system seemed thunderously loud. In comparison, Thompson's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This 4-star general, someone whose authority was beyond anything Thompson had ever encountered, wasn't just vouching for the woman he'd accused of carrying fake identification. He was describing her as one of his most trusted officers, someone with security clearances and accomplishments that Thompson couldn't even comprehend. "Sir, I was just ... Thompson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were just what?" General Harrison interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. "Just doing your job? Just following protocol? Or were you making assumptions based on what you thought a military officer should look like?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what it was. Everyone in the lobby could see the truth of the situation now. Thompson hadn't questioned Sarah's identification because of any real security concerns. He had questioned it because his prejudices had told him that a Latina woman couldn't possibly be a high-ranking military officer. Sarah remained at attention, but inside she was experiencing a complex mix of emotions. Relief that her credentials were being validated, anger at the discrimination she'd faced, and professional embarrassment that the situation had escalated to the point where a 4-star general had become involved. She knew that this incident would follow her throughout her career, though she couldn't yet predict whether it would help or hurt her in the long run. Johnson, the female security guard who had tried to handle the situation more professionally, stepped forward hesitantly. "General, sir, I apologize for this situation. I was attempting to verify the identification through proper channels when you arrived." General Harrison's expression softened slightly when he looked at Johnson. "What's your name, guard?" "Johnson." "Sir, Senior Security Officer Johnson." Officer Johnson, what is the standard protocol when military identification is presented at this checkpoint? Johnson straightened, grateful to be able to demonstrate that she knew proper procedure. Sir, all military identification is verified through the Defense Department database. If there are any questions about authenticity, we contact the issuing authority directly rather than making determinations based on visual inspection alone. And was this protocol followed in Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's case? Johnson glanced nervously at Thompson before answering. No, sir. Officer Thompson determined the identification was fraudulent based on visual inspection and refused to run it through verification. General Harrison nodded slowly, his attention returning to Thompson, who looked like he was about to be sick. Officer Thompson, do you understand that what you just did wasn't simply a mistaken procedure? You accused a decorated military officer of fraud, theft of government property, and stolen valor. Do you comprehend the seriousness of those accusations? Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just going to result in a reprimand or additional training. This was career-ending and potentially criminal, depending on how the situation was handled. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger as word spread through the building that something significant was happening in the lobby. Federal employees were discreetly positioning themselves to witness what was clearly a historic moment. Several people were still recording with their phones, though they were being much more careful about it now that a four-star general was involved. Among the crowd, Sarah noticed the older gentleman she'd spotted earlier, the one whose bearing had suggested military background. He was watching the proceedings with the kind of intense focus that indicated he understood exactly what was happening and why it mattered. When their eyes briefly met, he gave her an almost imperceptible nod of support and respect. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, General Harrison said, turning back to Sarah. I owe you an apology. Not just as your commanding officer, but as someone who has sworn to ensure that every service member is treated with the dignity and respect they've earned. This should never have happened. Sarah maintained her position of attention as she replied. Sir, no apology necessary. I understand that security personnel have challenging jobs and must be vigilant. But General Harrison shook his head. No, Colonel. What happened here wasn't vigilance, it was prejudice. And it's exactly the kind of discrimination that we've sworn to eliminate from our military and from any institution we interact with. He turned back to Thompson, who was now visibly sweating despite the building's air conditioning. Officer Thompson, you have exactly 30 seconds to return Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's identification. Provide her with a formal apology and allow her to proceed to her meeting. After that, you and I are going to have a conversation with your supervisor about what appropriate consequences look like for this kind of conduct. Thompson's hand shook as he extended Sarah's ID toward her. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Your identification it's legitimate, and I should have followed proper procedures. Sarah took her ID back with professional dignity, though everyone could see the controlled anger in her eyes. Thank you, Officer Thompson. I hope this serves as a learning experience. But General Harrison wasn't finished. As Sarah prepared to proceed through security, the general did something that no one in the lobby expected. In full view of the assembled crowd, with phones recording and federal employees watching, General Harrison came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. The gesture was unprecedented. A four-star general saluting a lieutenant colonel in a civilian building, in front of civilian witnesses, was not just unusual, it was a public statement of respect and support that would be talked about for years to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah returned the salute with equal precision, her military bearing perfect despite the emotional weight of the moment. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, But its impact on everyone present was profound and lasting. The moment General Harrison's salute was returned by Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, something shifted in the federal building lobby that went far beyond the resolution of a simple security dispute. The assembled crowd of federal employees, contractors, and visitors had just witnessed something that many of them would remember for the rest of their lives, a powerful demonstration of military honor, respect, and the consequences of prejudicial behavior. As Sarah finally proceeded through the security checkpoint, her military bearing intact despite the ordeal she'd endured, General Harrison turned his attention back to the security situation that had created this mess. His job was far from over. In fact, the most important part of his intervention was just beginning. "Officer Thompson," General Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I need you to understand something very clearly. What just happened here wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity or over-enthusiastic security measures. What happened here was discrimination, plain and simple." Thompson, who had been hoping that returning Sarah's ID and mumbling an apology would be the end of his problems, realized with growing horror that his ordeal was just beginning. The general's tone made it clear that there would be serious consequences for his actions. "Sir, I was just trying to do my job," Thompson said. Weakly, attempting one last defense of his conduct, General Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to verify identification and ensure building security. Your job is not to make judgments about who does or doesn't look like military material. Your job is not to assume that a legitimate military ID is fake because it belongs to a woman of color. And your job is certainly not to humiliate a decorated officer in front of a crowd of people." The general's words cut through the lobby like a blade, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than just a dressing down of a security guard. They were seeing a senior military leader taking a public stand against discrimination and prejudice. Johnson, the other security guard, had been standing quietly to the side, but General Harrison now addressed her directly. "Officer Johnson, I want you to call your supervisor immediately. This incident needs to be documented, investigated, and addressed at the highest levels of your organization." "Yes, sir," Johnson replied, already reaching for her radio. She was grateful that the general had recognized her attempts to handle the situation more professionally, but she also understood that as Thompson's colleague, she would likely face questions about why she hadn't intervened more forcefully. As Johnson made the call, General Harrison noticed that several people in the crowd were still recording the aftermath of the incident. Rather than being annoyed by this, he saw it as an opportunity. In an age where discrimination often went unchallenged because it happened behind closed doors, having this incident documented could serve as a powerful example. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison said, addressing the crowd directly, "I want you all to understand what you've witnessed here today. You've seen what happens when prejudice and assumption take the place of professional conduct and proper procedure. But more importantly, you've seen that discrimination and disrespect will not be tolerated, not in our military, not in our federal buildings, and not in our society." The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. The older gentleman, who had caught Sarah's attention earlier, stepped forward slightly. "General, sir," the man said, his own military bearing evident in his posture, "if I may introduce myself, Colonel James Patterson, retired. I served under your command during the Iraqi operations in 2018. General Harrison's expression warmed slightly as he recognized the retired officer. "Colonel Patterson, good to see you again. I assume you witnessed this entire incident?" "Yes, sir, I did. And if I may say so, sir, your handling of this situation exemplifies exactly the kind of leadership our military needs." That young officer, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, handled herself with remarkable professionalism under very trying circumstances. General Harrison nodded. "She did indeed. Colonel Martinez is one of our finest officers, and she deserved better than what she experienced here today." By this time, The building's security supervisor had arrived, summoned by Johnson's radio call. Supervisor Margaret Walsh was a 20-year veteran of federal security who had seen her share of difficult situations, but she had never been called to deal with an incident involving a 4-star general and allegations of discrimination against a military officer. "General Harrison," Walsh said as she approached, her own bearing respectful but professional, "I'm Margaret Walsh, Security Operations Supervisor. I understand we have a serious situation here." "Supervisor Walsh," General Harrison replied, "we do indeed. One of your officers, Thompson, has just subjected Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez to discriminatory treatment, false accusations, and professional humiliation. The lieutenant colonel was attempting to enter this building for a legitimate meeting when Officer Thompson declared her military identification fraudulent and refused to follow proper verification procedures." Walsh's expression grew increasingly grim as General Harrison continued his explanation. She had been in federal security long enough to know that an incident like this could have serious consequences not just for Thompson, but for the entire security operation. "Officer Thompson," Walsh said, turning to the guard who was now looking like he wished he could disappear entirely, "is this account accurate?" Thompson's response was barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." Walsh closed her eyes for a moment, clearly processing the magnitude of the situation. When she opened them, her expression was one of professional resignation mixed with anger. "General Harrison, on behalf of our entire security operation, I want to apologize for Officer Thompson's conduct. This is absolutely not the standard we expect from our personnel, and it will be addressed immediately and thoroughly." The general nodded, but his expression made it clear that apologies alone would not be sufficient. Supervisor Walsh's apology hung in the air of the federal building lobby, but everyone present could sense that General Harrison expected more than just words. The 4-star general had not intervened in this situation simply to receive an apology and move on. He was here to ensure that real change occurred, and that this type of discrimination would not happen again. "Supervisor Walsh," General Harrison said, his tone measured but firm, "I appreciate your apology, but I need to understand what concrete steps will be taken to address this incident and prevent similar occurrences in the future." Walsh nodded, her expression serious as she began to outline the immediate steps that would be taken. "General, Officer Thompson will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation. We will review all security camera footage of this incident, interview witnesses, and conduct a complete evaluation of our identification verification procedures." "And what about training?" General Harrison asked. "Because what happened here suggests that your security personnel may need additional education about military identification, proper verification procedures, and perhaps most importantly about treating all individuals with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or background." Thompson, who had been standing silently throughout this exchange, finally seemed to grasp the full scope of what his actions had set in motion. He wasn't just facing disciplinary action, he was at the center of an incident that would likely result in policy changes, additional training requirements, and increased oversight for the entire security operation. "Sir," Thompson said, his voice cracking slightly, "I want to apologize again. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made, and I let my personal biases affect my professional judgment." It was the first time Thompson had acknowledged that his actions were based on prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. The admission was significant, but General Harrison's expression suggested it was too little too late. "Officer Thompson," General Harrison replied, "the fact that you can now recognize your bias is important, but it doesn't undo the harm you caused. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez is one of our military's most promising leaders. She has served multiple combat deployments, has been entrusted with our nation's most sensitive intelligence, and has earned the respect of everyone who has served with her. Your actions today weren't just disrespectful to her personally, they were disrespectful to every service member who has earned their place through sacrifice and dedication. The crowd that had gathered to witness this confrontation was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Several federal employees who had military backgrounds were nodding in agreement with General Harrison's words, clearly appreciating his defense of military personnel and his intolerance for discrimination. Colonel Patterson, the retired officer who had spoken up earlier, approached General Harrison once more. "Sir, if I may, I think this incident highlights a broader issue that we face as veterans and active duty personnel. Too often, people make assumptions about who we are based on their preconceived notions rather than our actual service records." General Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right, Colonel. And that's exactly why incidents like this can't be swept under the rug or handled quietly. When discrimination occurs, particularly in federal facilities, it needs to be addressed publicly and thoroughly." Supervisor Walsh had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and she now looked up from her notebook. "General Harrison, I want to assure you that this incident will be handled with the seriousness it deserves. In addition to the immediate disciplinary action against Officer Thompson, we will be implementing mandatory bias awareness training for all security personnel, reviewing our ID verification procedures, and establishing a direct reporting mechanism for any similar incidents in the future." "I'm glad to hear that," General Harrison replied. "But I also want to ensure that Lieutenant Colonel Martinez is comfortable with how this situation is being resolved. She's the one who was subjected to this treatment, and her perspective on appropriate remedies should be considered." This was an important point that many organizations often overlooked when addressing discrimination: the victim's voice in determining appropriate consequences and corrective actions. By insisting that Sarah's input be considered, General Harrison was demonstrating leadership that went beyond simply defending a subordinate officer. Meanwhile, Sarah had proceeded to her scheduled meeting, but the incident in the lobby was far from over in terms of its impact on her day and her career. The meeting she was attending was with senior Defense Department officials about a joint operations initiative, and word of what had happened in the building lobby was already beginning to spread through the federal complex. When Sarah arrived at the conference room, she found that news of the incident had preceded her. The senior officials present, including 2 brigadier generals and several high-ranking civilian administrators, were already aware that something significant had occurred involving her and building security. "Colonel Martinez," said Brigadier General Patricia Williams, rising from her seat as Sarah entered the room, "we understand you had quite an ordeal getting into the building this morning. Are you all right?" Sarah straightened, determined not to let the morning's events affect her professionalism. "Yes, ma'am, I'm fine, thank you. I apologize if the delay has affected our schedule." "There's no need to apologize," replied Dr. Michael Chun, the senior civilian administrator overseeing the Joint Operations Project. "From what we've heard, you handled yourself with remarkable composure under very trying circumstances. General Harrison spoke very highly of your conduct when he called to brief us on the situation." The fact that General Harrison had already contacted the meeting participants demonstrated just how seriously he was taking the incident. It also showed his commitment to ensuring that Sarah's professional reputation was protected rather than damaged by what had occurred. Back in the lobby, the aftermath of the confrontation was continuing to unfold. Supervisor Walsh had completed her initial assessment of the situation and was preparing to escort Officer Thompson to her office for a more detailed discussion about his future with the security service. "Officer Thompson," Walsh said, her tone professional but unmistakably disappointed, "you need to understand that this incident has created liability issues that extend far beyond a simple personnel matter. The discrimination you displayed today could result in legal action, congressional inquiry, and federal investigation. Thompson's face went even paler as the full scope of potential consequences became clear. He had started his day thinking he was doing his job conscientiously, and now he was facing the possibility of losing not just his employment, but potentially facing legal consequences for his discriminatory actions. General Harrison, who had been observing this exchange, stepped forward one final time. "Supervisor Walsh, I want to be clear about something. This incident will be reported through military channels as well as civilian ones. The Department of Defense takes discrimination against our personnel very seriously, and we will be conducting our own investigation to ensure that appropriate measures are taken to prevent similar incidents in the future." The general's words carried an implicit threat that went beyond anything the building's security service could impose. Military investigations had the power to affect federal contracts, security clearances, and even the facility's ability to continue serving as a location for sensitive government meetings. As General Harrison prepared to leave the lobby, he turned to address the remaining crowd one final time. "What you witnessed here today should serve as a reminder that discrimination and prejudice have no place in our federal institutions. Every person who serves our country, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of honor." With that, the general headed toward the elevators, leaving behind a lobby full of people who had just witnessed a master class in leadership, accountability, and the importance of standing up against discrimination. The incident was over, but its impact was just beginning to be felt. 3 hours after the confrontation in the federal building lobby, Sarah Martinez sat in the Pentagon's executive conference room, participating in what should have been a routine briefing about joint military operations. But nothing about this day had been routine, and the ripple effects of the morning's incident were continuing to spread through the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The meeting had gone well. Sarah's presentation on inter-service coordination protocols had been received with enthusiasm and approval from the senior officials present. Her professional competence and composure had made it clear to everyone in the room why General Harrison held her in such high regard. But as the formal session concluded, Brigadier General Williams asked Sarah to remain behind for a private conversation. "Colonel," General Williams said once they were alone, "I want to discuss what happened this morning, not from an operational standpoint, but from a career perspective. Incidents like this, even when they're completely unjustified, can sometimes have unexpected consequences for the officers involved." Sarah appreciated the general's candor. She had been thinking about the same issue throughout the meeting. In an ideal world, being the victim of discrimination would have no negative impact on her career prospects. But military careers were built on reputation and perception, and any high-profile incident, regardless of who was at fault, could potentially affect future assignments and promotions. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," Sarah replied. "I've been wondering the same thing myself. I handled the situation as professionally as I could, but I'm aware that being at the center of a discrimination incident, even as the victim, can sometimes be viewed negatively by certain people." General Williams nodded. "Unfortunately, you're right. There are still people in our system who might question whether you brought this on yourself somehow, or who might worry that you're now a liability because of the attention this incident is generating. It's unfair and it's wrong, but it's a reality we need to address." This conversation was taking place against the backdrop of growing attention to the morning's events. The video recordings that had been taken by bystanders were already beginning to circulate on social media, and news organizations were starting to pick up the story. The sight of a 4-star general saluting a lieutenant colonel in a civilian building lobby was unusual enough to generate significant interest, and the backstory of discrimination was making it even more compelling to news outlets. However, General Williams continued, I want you to know that General Harrison has been in contact with senior leadership throughout the afternoon, and the consensus is clear. Your handling of this situation reflects exactly the kind of leadership and professionalism we want to see from our officers. If anything, this incident has enhanced your reputation rather than damaged it. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The support from senior leadership was crucial, not just for her immediate peace of mind, but for her long-term career prospects. Having the backing of officers like General Harrison and General Williams would help protect her from any potential backlash from people who might view her as a troublemaker or attention seeker. Meanwhile, back at the federal building, the consequences of the morning's incident were continuing to unfold. Officer Thompson had been escorted from the premises after his meeting with Supervisor Walsh, his security badge confiscated, and his employment terminated immediately. The speed and decisiveness of the action reflected both the seriousness of his conduct and the building management's recognition that they needed to demonstrate clear accountability. Johnson, the other security guard who had tried to handle the situation more professionally, had been interviewed extensively about the incident. Her account corroborated everything that had been captured on video and confirmed that Thompson's actions had been based on prejudicial assumptions rather than legitimate security concerns. Johnson, Supervisor Walsh said after completing the interview, "I want you to understand that your conduct during this incident is being viewed very favorably. You attempted to follow proper procedures, you treated Colonel Martinez with respect, and you tried to de-escalate the situation. That's exactly the kind of professionalism we expect from our security personnel." Johnson nodded, but she was clearly still troubled by what had happened. "Ma'am, I keep thinking I should have intervened more forcefully when I saw that Thompson wasn't following protocol. Maybe if I had pushed back harder, the situation wouldn't have escalated the way it did." "Johnson, you can't blame yourself for Thompson's choices," Walsh replied. "You did attempt to redirect the situation toward proper procedures. The failure here was Thompson's failure to listen to you and follow established protocols." The conversation between Walsh and Johnson was interrupted by a phone call that would add another layer of complexity to the situation. The caller was a reporter from the Washington Post who had seen the social media videos and was requesting an official statement about the incident. "Ms. Walsh, this is Jennifer Cooper from the Washington Post. We understand that there was an incident this morning involving discrimination against a military officer at your facility. Can you provide us with an official statement about what occurred and what steps are being taken to address it?" Walsh had been expecting this call, but it still made her stomach tighten. Media attention would bring additional scrutiny to the incident and could potentially create problems for everyone involved, depending on how the story was framed. "Ms. Cooper, I can confirm that there was an incident this morning involving a misunderstanding about military identification. The matter has been investigated and appropriate action has been taken. I'm not able to provide additional details due to personnel privacy considerations." But Cooper was persistent, as good reporters tend to be. "Ms. Walsh, we have video evidence showing a 4-star general intervening in this situation and saluting the officer who was being questioned. This suggests that the incident was more serious than a simple misunderstanding. Can you comment on whether discrimination was a factor in what occurred?" The question put Walsh in a difficult position. She couldn't deny what was clearly visible in the video evidence, but she also couldn't make statements that might affect ongoing personnel actions or potential legal proceedings. "Ms. Cooper, as I said, the incident has been investigated and appropriate action has been taken. Any discrimination that occurred would be absolutely contrary to our policies and values and would be addressed accordingly." Cooper pressed further. "Can you confirm that the security officer involved in this incident is no longer employed by your organization?" Walsh paused, recognizing that her answer would likely be the key quote in whatever story the Post published. "I can confirm that personnel action has been taken, but I cannot discuss specific employment matters." After ending the call, Walsh sat back in her chair and considered the challenges ahead. The story was clearly going to be published, and depending on how it was written, it could either portray the building security service as having handled the situation appropriately, or as having failed to prevent discrimination in the first place. More importantly, the media attention would likely prompt additional scrutiny from federal oversight agencies, congressional offices, and advocacy organizations. The incident that had started as a confrontation between one prejudiced security guard and one professional military officer was rapidly expanding into a much larger conversation about discrimination, accountability, and leadership. By evening, the story of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez and her confrontation with building security had taken on a life of its own. The Washington Post article, published online at 6:47 p.m., was already generating hundreds of comments and shares across social media platforms. The headline read, "4-star general salutes officer after security guard claims her military ID was fake." Sarah was at home in her modest apartment, still processing the events of what had been one of the most challenging and surreal days of her military career. She had changed out of her dress blues and was sitting at her kitchen table, laptop open, reading the news coverage of the incident with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. The article was largely accurate and presented her in a favorable light. But Sarah knew that being the subject of national news attention, even positive attention, could be a double-edged sword for a military officer. On one hand, the story highlighted important issues about discrimination and the proper treatment of service members. On the other hand, it made her a public figure in a way that could complicate her ability to serve effectively in sensitive assignments. Her phone had been ringing constantly throughout the evening. Friends and colleagues from around the military were calling to express support and to ask if the news reports were accurate. Her parents had called from Texas, worried and proud in equal measure. Her younger brother, also in the military, had texted to say that the story was being discussed throughout his entire unit, but perhaps the most significant call had come from General Harrison's office. His aide had contacted her to let her know that the general wanted to meet with her the following morning to discuss the ongoing situation and its potential impact on her career and current assignments. As Sarah read through the comments on the news article, she was struck by the range of responses from the public. Many people were expressing outrage at Thompson's discriminatory behavior and praising General Harrison's intervention. But there were also comments questioning whether the incident had been blown out of proportion, and unfortunately, some that suggested Sarah had somehow provoked the confrontation or was seeking attention. One comment in particular caught her attention. "I served for 20 years and never saw anyone question a legitimate military ID. Something doesn't add up about this story." Sarah stared at that comment for a long moment, feeling a familiar frustration. Even when presented with clear evidence of discrimination, some people would rather question the victim's account than acknowledge that prejudice still existed in their institutions. It was exactly this kind of thinking that allowed discrimination to persist and made it difficult for victims to come forward. Meanwhile, across the city, Thompson was sitting in his own apartment, facing the wreckage of his career and reputation. The news article had not named him specifically, but in the age of social media, his identity wouldn't remain secret for long. He had already received several calls from reporters seeking comment, and he knew it was only a matter of time before his name and photograph were widely circulated. Thompson's wife, Maria, had been supportive but honest in her assessment of the situation. "David, you need to understand that what you did was wrong. I've watched you make comments about people based on their appearance or background, and I've tried to tell you that those attitudes would get you in trouble someday." It was a painful conversation, but one that Thompson needed to have. His actions hadn't occurred in a vacuum. They were the result of biases and prejudices that had been building over years of casual racism and discrimination that had gone unchallenged in his personal life. "Maria, I know I screwed up," Thompson replied. "But I don't know how to fix this. I've lost my job. I'm probably going to be blacklisted from federal security work. And now I'm going to be nationally known as the guy who discriminated against. A war hero." Maria's response was direct and necessary. "David, you can't fix what you did to that officer. But you can learn from it and make sure you never treat someone that way again. And maybe, if you're really serious about changing, you can use this experience to help other people understand why this kind of discrimination is so harmful." Back at the Pentagon, General Harrison was in his office late into the evening, dealing with the fallout from the day's events. The incident had generated attention not just from news media, but from congressional offices, advocacy organizations, and senior Defense Department leadership. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened and what steps were being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The general's aide, Major Roberts, knocked on the office door and entered with a stack of messages and requests for information. "Sir, we've received calls from the offices of 6 different senators, the House Armed Services Committee, 3 different military advocacy organizations, and the NAACP. Everyone wants to know our official position on what happened and what measures we're taking to address discrimination against military personnel." General Harrison rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation. While he didn't regret his intervention, it had been absolutely necessary and appropriate. He recognized that the incident was now raising broader questions about military-civilian relations, discrimination in federal facilities, and the treatment of service members by civilian contractors. "Major Roberts, I want you to coordinate with the Pentagon press office to prepare a comprehensive statement about today's incident. The statement should make clear that discrimination against military personnel will not be tolerated, that we support Lieutenant Colonel Martinez completely, and that we expect all federal facilities to maintain the highest standards of professionalism when interacting with our service members." "Yes, sir." "Should we also address the broader policy implications? Several of the congressional offices are asking about what systemic changes might be needed to prevent similar incidents." General Harrison considered the question carefully. The incident with Sarah had highlighted real problems that went beyond one prejudiced security guard. If military personnel were facing discrimination at federal facilities, it suggested the need for better training, clearer protocols, and stronger oversight mechanisms. Yes, include language about our commitment to working with civilian agencies to improve training and procedures. This incident should serve as a wake-up call about the need for better education about military identification, proper verification procedures, and respectful treatment of all individuals. As Major Roberts left to begin drafting the statement, General Harrison turned his attention to preparing for his meeting with Sarah the following morning. He needed to discuss not just the immediate aftermath of the incident, but its potential long-term impact on her career and assignments. The general recognized that Sarah was at a crossroads. The national attention generated by the incident could either propel her career forward, demonstrating her professionalism under pressure and highlighting her as a role model for other officers, or it could create complications that would affect her ability to serve in sensitive positions that required her to maintain a low profile. Either way, General Harrison was determined to ensure that Sarah's career prospects were enhanced rather than harmed by an incident that had been entirely beyond her control. She had handled herself with distinction under extremely trying circumstances, and she deserved to have her leadership support her completely as she navigated the aftermath. The next morning arrived with a crispness that matched the clarity General Harrison hoped to bring to his meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. Sarah arrived at the Pentagon at precisely 0800 hours, her uniform immaculate as always, but carrying herself with a new awareness of the public attention that now surrounded her every move. As she walked through the Pentagon's corridors, Sarah noticed the subtle changes in how people interacted with her. Some colleagues offered supportive nods and words of encouragement. Others seemed to study her more carefully, as if trying to reconcile the person they knew with the figure from yesterday's news coverage. A few appeared uncomfortable, perhaps uncertain about how to address the situation, or worried about being associated with controversy. General Harrison's office was located in the Pentagon's executive wing, and Sarah had been there many times for briefings and planning sessions. But today felt different. Today, she wasn't just reporting for duty. She was there to discuss how a discriminatory incident had thrust her into the national spotlight, and what that meant for her future as a military officer. Colonel Martinez, General Harrison said as she entered his office, "Please have a seat. I trust you've had a chance to see some of the media coverage from yesterday's incident." "Yes, sir, I have," Sarah replied, taking the offered chair across from the general's desk. "The coverage has been largely accurate, though I'm still processing what it means to be the subject of national news attention." General Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. Yesterday's incident has created both opportunities and challenges for your career, and I want to make sure we navigate them appropriately." The general opened a folder on his desk containing printouts of news articles, social media posts, and official communications that had been generated by the previous day's events. "First, I want you to know that the response from military leadership has been overwhelmingly supportive. Your conduct yesterday exemplified exactly the kind of professionalism and dignity we expect from our officers under pressure." Sarah felt a measure of relief at hearing this confirmation of support from senior leadership. "Thank you, sir. I tried to handle the situation as professionally as possible, but I was concerned about how being involved in a public controversy might affect my career prospects." "That's a legitimate concern," General Harrison acknowledged, "and it's one we need to address directly. The reality is that this incident has made you a more visible figure within the military and in the broader public consciousness. That visibility can be an asset, but it also comes with responsibilities and potential complications." The general leaned forward, his expression serious but supportive. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. Your handling of yesterday's situation has impressed people at the highest levels of military leadership. There are senior officers who see you as someone who can represent the best of what our military stands for: professionalism, integrity, and dignity in the face of adversity." This was not what Sarah had expected to hear. She had been worried that the incident might mark her as a troublemaker or someone who attracted unwanted attention. Instead, it seemed to be enhancing her reputation among the people whose opinions mattered most for her career advancement. However, General Harrison continued, "This kind of visibility also means that your future assignments and activities will be subject to additional scrutiny. Some of the sensitive positions you might otherwise be considered for could be complicated by your public profile." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. Military officers in certain intelligence and special operations roles needed to maintain low profiles and avoid public attention. The media coverage of yesterday's incident might make her unsuitable for some of those positions, at least in the short term, but General Harrison had more to say. On the other hand, there are leadership positions, including some very senior ones, where your experience and your demonstrated ability to handle difficult situations with grace would be tremendous assets. The kind of visibility you now have could actually accelerate your advancement in those areas. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Major Roberts entered with a concerned expression and a message that would add another dimension to the situation. "General." "Sir, I apologize for the interruption, but we've received a request from the Congressional Black Caucus. They would like to invite Colonel Martinez to testify at a hearing they're planning about discrimination in federal facilities and the treatment of military personnel." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Testifying before Congress would thrust her even further into the public eye and potentially create political complications for her military career. Military officers were generally expected to avoid political involvement, and congressional testimony could be seen as crossing that line. General Harrison studied the request carefully before responding. Major Roberts, please inform the Congressional Black Caucus that we appreciate their interest in this issue, but any decision about Colonel Martinez's potential testimony would need to be coordinated through the Defense Department's Legislative Affairs Office and would require careful consideration of the military's non-political role. After Major Roberts left, General Harrison turned back to Sarah. This is exactly the kind of complication I was referring to. The incident has made you a symbol of broader issues about discrimination and military service, and various organizations are going to want to use your story to advance their agendas, even if those agendas are ones you might personally support. Sarah understood the delicate balance involved. While she might personally support efforts to combat discrimination, her role as a military officer required her to maintain political neutrality and avoid becoming involved in partisan activities. Sir, how do you recommend I handle these kinds of requests? Sarah asked. Very carefully, General Harrison replied. Any public appearances or statements you make need to be coordinated through appropriate channels and focused on military professionalism rather than political advocacy. You can certainly speak about the importance of treating all service members with dignity and respect, but you need to avoid taking positions on broader political issues. The general paused, then continued with something that sounded almost like fatherly advice. Sarah, you're at a pivotal point in your career. The way you handle the next few months will determine whether yesterday's incident becomes a launching pad for advancement or a limiting factor for your future assignments. My advice is to stay focused on your military duties, maintain your professionalism, and let your service record speak for itself. As their meeting concluded, General Harrison stood and extended his hand to Sarah. Colonel, I want you to know that you have my complete support as you navigate this situation. Yesterday's incident was not your fault, and it should not be allowed to negatively impact your career. But how you handle the aftermath will be entirely within your control, and I have complete confidence in your judgment. Sarah left the general's office with a clearer understanding of both the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead. The incident that had started as a simple case of discrimination had evolved into something much larger, and she would need to navigate the resulting attention with the same professionalism and integrity that had gotten her through the original confrontation. 6 months after the incident at the federal building, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez stood before a mirror in her quarters, adjusting the silver oak leaves on her collar for what would be the last time. Tomorrow she would be promoted to full colonel, making her one of the youngest officers to achieve that rank in recent years. The promotion ceremony would be presided over by General Harrison himself, bringing their relationship full circle from that dramatic morning in the federal building lobby. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of activity and recognition. Sarah had been selected for the National Defense University's Advanced Leadership Program, had received a commendation for her handling of the discrimination incident, and had been assigned to a prestigious position in Joint Operations Planning. That would put her on track for future command positions, but perhaps more importantly, the incident had sparked meaningful changes in how military personnel were treated at federal facilities across the country. The Defense Department had worked with civilian agencies to implement new training programs for security personnel, improved identification verification procedures, and clearer protocols for addressing discrimination complaints. Thompson, the former security guard whose prejudice had started the entire chain of events, had used the 6 months to begin a journey of personal reflection and growth. After losing his job and facing public scrutiny, he had initially been bitter and defensive. But with the help of counseling and some difficult conversations with his family, he had begun to understand the deeper issues that had led to his discriminatory behavior, Thompson had reached out to several civil rights organizations, offering to share his story as an example of how unconscious bias could lead to harmful actions. While he could never undo the damage he had caused to Sarah and to the military's trust in civilian contractors, he was working to ensure that his mistakes might help others avoid similar failures. "I spent years telling myself I wasn't prejudiced," Thompson had said during one of his speaking engagements at a diversity training session. "But when I saw that officer, I made assumptions based on what I thought a military leader should look like, rather than on the legitimate identification she presented. It was discrimination, plain and simple, and it took losing my job and facing national criticism for me to acknowledge that truth." Meanwhile, the broader impact of the incident continued to ripple through military and civilian communities. The video of General Harrison saluting Sarah had become a powerful symbol of military leadership and the importance of standing up against discrimination. Military academies were using the incident as a case study in leadership under pressure, and diversity training programs across the federal government were incorporating the story as an example of both the persistence of discrimination and the importance of allyship. Sarah had received hundreds of letters and emails from service members, veterans, and civilians who had been inspired by her handling of the situation. Many were from women and minorities in the military who shared their own experiences with discrimination and expressed gratitude that someone in a position of authority had publicly stood up against such treatment. One letter from a young Hispanic woman who had just completed basic training particularly moved Sarah. "Colonel Martinez, seeing how you handled that situation with such dignity and professionalism gave me hope that I could succeed in the military despite the challenges I might face. Your example showed me that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, is what real leadership looks like." General Harrison had also seen his reputation enhanced by the incident. His immediate and decisive intervention had been praised by military leadership, civil rights organizations, and the general public. But for the general, the most important outcome was the positive changes that had resulted from the situation. What happened that day wasn't just about defending one officer, General Harrison had told a gathering of senior military leaders. It was about defending the principles that our military is supposed to represent: integrity, respect, and the fundamental dignity of every person who serves our country. The federal building where the original incident had occurred had also undergone significant changes. Supervisor Walsh had implemented comprehensive reforms to the security operation, including mandatory bias training, improved identification verification procedures, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. The building had actually become a model for other federal facilities, seeking to improve their treatment of military personnel and other visitors. Johnson, the security guard who had tried to handle the situation more professionally, had been promoted to a supervisory position and had become a key trainer for new security personnel. Her account of the incident and her efforts to de-escalate the situation were used as examples of proper professional conduct. As Sarah prepared for her promotion ceremony, she reflected on how the incident had changed not just her career, but her perspective on leadership and advocacy. She had always been committed to serving her country with distinction, but the experience had shown her the importance of using her position to stand up for others who might face similar discrimination. The promotion ceremony took place in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, with an audience that included senior military leadership, Sarah's family, and colleagues from throughout her career. When General Harrison called her forward to receive her new rank, the moment carried special significance for everyone present who remembered the dramatic confrontation 6 months earlier. "Colonel Sarah Martinez," General Harrison said as he pinned the eagle insignia to her uniform, "represents the very best of what our military can be. Her service record speaks for itself, but her conduct under adversity has shown us all what true leadership looks like." As the ceremony concluded and Sarah received congratulations from friends and colleagues, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The discrimination she had faced could have been a career-ending catastrophe, but instead, it had become a defining moment that had enhanced her reputation and opened new opportunities for service and leadership. More importantly, the incident had contributed to meaningful changes that would benefit other service members for years to come. The training programs, policy changes, and cultural shifts that had resulted from that morning's confrontation would help ensure that future military personnel would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Colonel Martinez's story had become more than just an account of one person overcoming discrimination. It had become a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of allyship, and the possibility of creating positive change even from the most challenging circumstances. The young officer who had entered that federal building 6 months earlier had emerged as a symbol of resilience, professionalism, and the enduring values that made the military strong. Her promotion to colonel was not just recognition of her individual achievements, but acknowledgement of the broader impact her story had had on military culture and civilian-military relations. As she left the ceremony, Colonel Martinez knew that her most important service to her country might not be the mission she would lead or the strategies she would develop, but the example she had set for others about how to face adversity with dignity, how to demand respect while maintaining professionalism, and how to turn a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for lasting positive change. 2 years had passed since that transformative morning in the federal building lobby, and Colonel Sarah Martinez found herself standing before a classroom of young military officers at the National Defense University. The irony was not lost on her. She was now teaching a course on leadership under adversity, and the case study she was about to present was her own experience with discrimination and the remarkable chain of events that had followed. Leadership, Sarah began, addressing the diverse group of captains and majors who would soon be taking on greater responsibilities within their respective services, is not something that only happens during planned moments or structured environments. Some of the most important leadership decisions we make occur when we're caught off guard, when we're facing unexpected challenges, and when the stakes are higher than we initially realized. The students in her classroom represented the future of military leadership, men and women from different branches of service, different backgrounds, and different perspectives, but all united by their commitment to serving their country with distinction. Many of them had heard about the incident that had made Sarah famous, but she rarely discussed it in detail during her lectures. Today would be different. I want to share with you a story about a morning that changed not just my career, but my understanding of what it means to lead by example, even when you don't realize anyone is watching, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority that had been strengthened by years of command experience and public recognition. As she began to recount the events of that September morning, Sarah watched her students' faces carefully. She could see the moment when they realized she was talking about her own experience, the shift from academic interest to personal engagement, as they understood they were hearing the story directly from someone who had lived through it. The security guard who questioned my identification that day made assumptions based on his preconceived notions about what a military officer should look like, Sarah explained. But the more important lesson isn't about his prejudice. It's about how we respond when we encounter discrimination, both as individuals and as leaders responsible for others. One of the students, a young African-American captain, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how did you maintain your composure when you knew you were being treated unfairly?" I've faced similar situations, and I struggle with balancing the need to stand up for myself with the requirement to maintain military bearing. It was exactly the kind of question Sarah had been hoping for, because it got to the heart of why she was sharing this story with future leaders. "Captain Johnson," Sarah replied, "that's perhaps the most important question you can ask. The answer is that maintaining composure doesn't mean accepting unfair treatment passively. It means responding to discrimination and prejudice in a way that advances your mission and upholds your values, even when you're angry, hurt, or frustrated. Sarah walked closer to the students, her expression becoming more personal and direct. That morning I was furious, I was embarrassed, I was hurt. But I also knew that how I responded would reflect not just on me, but on every woman, every Hispanic service member, and every officer who might face similar situations in the future. That knowledge gave me strength to maintain my professionalism even when I wanted to express my anger. Another student, a young white male major from the Air Force, raised his hand. "Colonel, what should those of us who haven't experienced this kind of discrimination do when we witness it happening to others?" Sarah smiled, appreciating the question because it showed the student understood that leadership wasn't just about personal conduct. It was about creating environments where all service members could succeed. "Major Stevens, that's where the real lesson of General Harrison's intervention becomes relevant," Sarah replied. "The general didn't have to get involved. He could have walked past the situation, assuming it wasn't his responsibility or that someone else would handle it. Instead, he recognized that discrimination against any service member was an attack on the values and integrity of the entire military." Sarah paused, letting that concept sink in before continuing. "As leaders, we have a responsibility to intervene when we see discrimination or unfair treatment, not just because it's the right thing to do morally, but because it's essential for maintaining unit cohesion, trust, and effectiveness. When we allow prejudice to go unchallenged, we're telling our subordinates that their value as human beings is less important than avoiding uncomfortable confrontations." The classroom had grown very quiet, with students taking notes and clearly processing the implications of what Sarah was saying. This wasn't just a story about one incident, it was a masterclass in leadership philosophy and practical application. But here's what I want you to understand about General Harrison's response. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of experience and reflection. His intervention wasn't just about defending me personally. It was about sending a clear message that discrimination has no place in our military or in any institution that serves our country. When he saluted me in that lobby, he was making a public statement about the values our military represents. A female Navy lieutenant raised her hand. "Ma'am, did you ever worry that being involved in such a high-profile incident might actually hurt your career prospects? I mean, even though you were the victim, did you concern yourself with being seen as controversial or difficult?" Sarah nodded, appreciating the honesty of the question. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, absolutely. That concern kept me awake for several nights after the incident. In a perfect world, being the victim of discrimination wouldn't affect your career prospects, but we don't live in a perfect world. There are still people who might view someone involved in a discrimination incident, even as the victim, as a potential liability or troublemaker." She walked back to the front of the classroom, her expression thoughtful. "But here's what I learned. Trying to avoid controversy by staying silent about discrimination doesn't protect your career. It just perpetuates the problem and makes it more likely that others will face similar treatment. Sometimes, standing up for what's right is more important than protecting yourself from potential negative consequences." Sarah clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a photograph from her promotion ceremony 2 years earlier. "The reality is that the incident enhanced rather than damaged my career prospects. But that wasn't something I could have predicted at the time. What I could control was how I responded to the situation, and I'm proud that I maintained my professionalism and dignity throughout the ordeal." An Army captain near the back of the room raised his hand. "Colonel, what happened to the security guard who discriminated against you? And do you think the consequences were appropriate?" It was a question Sarah had been asked many times over the past 2 years, and one that she had thought about extensively. Captain Williams Thompson, the security guard, lost his job, which was appropriate given the severity of his conduct. But what's more important to me is what he did afterward. He could have become bitter and defensive, blaming others for his situation. Instead, he used the experience as an opportunity for self-reflection and growth. He's now working with diversity training organizations, sharing his story as an example of how unconscious bias can lead to harmful actions. Sarah paused, her expression becoming more serious. I'm not suggesting that we should feel sorry for people who engage in discriminatory behavior, but I do think it's important to recognize that lasting change requires more than just punishment. It requires education, reflection, and a genuine commitment to doing better. The discussion continued for another 30 minutes, with students asking questions about leadership decision-making, the role of bystanders in discrimination situations, and the broader implications of the incident for military culture. As the class period drew to a close, Sarah offered her final thoughts on the experience. The incident that made me temporarily famous was ultimately about much more than one security guard's prejudice or one general's intervention, she said. It was about the kind of military we want to be, the values we want to represent, and the responsibility we all have to ensure that every person who serves our country is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. She looked around the classroom, making eye contact with as many students as possible. When you leave here and take on leadership positions, you will face situations where you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right. I hope that when those moments come, you'll remember that true leadership isn't about avoiding difficult conversations or controversial situations. It's about standing up for your people and your values, even when it's uncomfortable or risky. As the students filed out of the classroom, many stopped to thank Sarah for sharing her story and to ask additional questions about leadership challenges they were facing in their current assignments. It was clear that the lesson had resonated with them, not just as an interesting historical incident, but as a practical guide for their own leadership development. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her office at the National Defense University, reviewing the feedback forms that students had completed after the class. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many students commenting that the session had given them new perspectives on leadership, discrimination, and the importance of standing up for others. One comment from the young African-American captain who had asked the first question particularly stood out. Colonel Martinez's story showed me that experiencing discrimination doesn't make you weak or victimize. It can make you stronger and more committed to ensuring that others don't face similar treatment. Her example gives me confidence that I can handle difficult situations with dignity and professionalism. Reading that feedback, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident that had started as a humiliating and frustrating experience had ultimately become a tool for teaching and inspiring the next generation of military leaders. The discrimination she had faced had been painful, but it had also created opportunities to make a positive impact that extended far beyond her own career. 5 years after the incident that had changed her life, Colonel Sarah Martinez received a phone call that would once again put her at the center of national attention. But this time, the circumstances were entirely different, and the recognition she was about to receive represented the culmination of a distinguished career that had been shaped, but not defined by that morning in the federal building lobby. "Colonel Martinez," said the voice on the other end of the line, "this is General Patricia Williams calling from the Pentagon. I have the honor of informing you that you have been selected for promotion to Brigadier General. Congratulations, General Martinez." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Promotion to general officer rank was the pinnacle of a military career, achieved by only a small percentage of officers who dedicated their lives to service. But for Sarah, this promotion carried additional significance. She would be one of the youngest Hispanic women ever to achieve general officer rank in the U.S. military. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the emotional impact of the news. "I'm honored by the confidence that senior leadership has placed in me, and I look forward to serving at this new level of responsibility." General Williams continued, "Sarah, I want you to know that your selection was unanimous among the promotion board members. Your service record speaks for itself, but your leadership during challenging circumstances and your commitment to developing the next generation of officers made you an outstanding candidate. The reference to challenging circumstances was clearly an allusion to the discrimination incident that had brought Sarah national attention. But General Williams was acknowledging it as a demonstration of leadership rather than as a liability or complication. After ending the call, Sarah sat quietly in her office, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The young lieutenant who had entered that federal building 5 years earlier, carrying legitimate identification but facing discrimination based on prejudice and assumption, was now being promoted to general officer rank. The irony was not lost on her that Thompson, the security guard who had questioned whether she looked like military material, would soon see news coverage of her promotion to one of the highest ranks in the U.S. military. But Sarah's thoughts weren't focused on vindication or revenge. Instead, she was thinking about the responsibilities that came with her new rank and the opportunities it would provide to continue making positive changes in military culture and leadership development. Within hours of the official announcement, Sarah's phone was ringing with calls from reporters, colleagues, former students, and friends. The story of her promotion was particularly compelling to news organizations because of the contrast between her treatment 5 years earlier and her current achievement. General Martinez, said one reporter during a phone interview, "Your promotion comes exactly 5 years after the discrimination incident that brought you national attention. Do you see this as a form of vindication?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had thought carefully about how to respond. "I don't view my promotion as vindication, because I never doubted my qualifications or my commitment to serving my country. What I hope this promotion demonstrates is that discrimination and prejudice don't have to define or limit someone's potential. Hard work, dedication, and professionalism will ultimately be recognized and rewarded." The reporter pressed further. "What would you say to young women and minorities who are considering military service, but are concerned about facing discrimination?" "I would tell them that the military, like any large institution, is not perfect," Sarah replied. "They may face challenges and unfair treatment at times. But I would also tell them that the military has made tremendous progress in recent years, and that there are leaders at every level who are committed to ensuring that all service members are treated with dignity and respect. My own experience shows that while discrimination still exists, it doesn't have to prevent you from achieving your goals." Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, General Harrison, now a few months away from his own retirement, was reading the news coverage of Sarah's promotion with deep satisfaction. His intervention 5 years earlier had been instinctive and necessary, but he could never have predicted the positive trajectory that Sarah's career would take in the aftermath of that incident. "Sir," said his aide, "the media is asking if you'd like to comment on General Martinez's promotion, given your role in the incident that first brought her to national attention." General Harrison considered the request carefully. "Please prepare a statement saying that General Martinez's promotion is well-deserved recognition of her outstanding service record and leadership capabilities. Her conduct during the incident 5 years ago demonstrated exactly the kind of professionalism and integrity we expect from our senior officers, and I'm confident she will excel in her new role." The promotion ceremony was scheduled to take place 6 weeks later, and the guest list would include many of the people who had played important roles in Sarah's career and in the aftermath of the discrimination incident. General Harrison would perform the promotion, despite being close to retirement. Johnson, the security guard who had tried to handle the original situation professionally, had been invited to attend. Even Thompson, the former security guard whose discriminatory behavior had started the entire chain of events, had been invited, though it remained unclear whether he would accept. The ceremony would also be attended by dozens of Sarah's former students from the National Defense University, many of whom had gone on to leadership positions throughout the military. For them, seeing their former instructor promoted to general officer rank would serve as inspiration and proof that the leadership principles she had taught were not just theoretical concepts, but practical tools for career success and meaningful service. As news of the promotion spread through military communities, social media, and news outlets, Sarah began receiving messages from service members around the world who had been inspired by her story. Many shared their own experiences with discrimination and explained how her example had given them strength to persevere through their own challenges. One message from a young Hispanic Marine stationed overseas particularly moved Sarah. "General Martinez, when I was facing discrimination from my platoon sergeant last year, I remembered your story and how you maintained your dignity and professionalism even when you were being treated unfairly. That memory helped me handle my own situation with honor, and I'm happy to report that the issue was eventually resolved through proper channels. Thank you for showing us what leadership looks like." Reading messages like this, Sarah understood that her promotion to general officer rank was not just a personal achievement. It was a symbol of progress and possibility for countless other service members who had faced or might face similar challenges. The discrimination she had experienced 5 years earlier had been painful and unfair, but it had ultimately become part of a larger story about resilience, leadership, and positive change. The young officer who had been questioned about her fake military ID was now General Martinez, and her story was far from over. The promotion ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at the Pentagon, in the same Hall of Heroes where Sarah had been promoted to colonel 3 years earlier. But this ceremony carried significantly more weight and attention, both because of the rank being conferred and because of the symbolic importance of Sarah's journey from discrimination victim to general officer. As guests filed into the hall, the diverse crowd reflected the broad impact that Sarah's story had had on military and civilian communities. There were senior military leaders, family members, former students, colleagues, and representatives from civil rights organizations. Members of the media were also present, understanding that this ceremony represented a significant milestone in the ongoing conversation about diversity and leadership in the military. General Harrison, despite being just weeks away from his own retirement ceremony, had insisted on presiding over Sarah's promotion. As he stood at the podium preparing to begin the ceremony, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning 5 years earlier when he had walked into a federal building lobby and encountered discrimination in action. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority and gravitas that had made him one of the most respected leaders in the military. "We are gathered here today to witness the promotion of an exceptional officer to the rank of brigadier general. But this ceremony represents more than just one person's career advancement. It represents the best of what our military can be when we commit ourselves to recognizing and developing talent, regardless of background, gender, or any other factor, except merit and dedication." The audience listened intently as General Harrison continued his remarks, many of them knowing the backstory that had brought this moment additional significance. 5 years ago, I had the privilege of witnessing Colonel Martinez demonstrate remarkable leadership under pressure. She faced discrimination with dignity, maintained her professionalism under trying circumstances, and used her experience to teach and inspire others. Those qualities, integrity, resilience, and commitment to developing others, are exactly what we need in our senior leaders. As General Harrison called Sarah forward to receive her new rank, she walked with the same military bearing that had impressed him years earlier, but now carrying the additional confidence that came from proven leadership experience and hard-earned recognition. "Sarah Martinez," General Harrison said as he began pinning the single star of a brigadier general to her uniform, "you have served your country with distinction at every level of responsibility. Your promotion to general officer rank is recognition not just of your individual achievements, but of your commitment to making our military better for everyone who serves." The moment the star was pinned to Sarah's uniform, the audience erupted in applause that seemed to last forever. But among the most enthusiastic applauders was Johnson, the security guard whose professional conduct during the original incident had helped prevent an even worse situation. She had been promoted to a senior position in federal security and had become a national advocate for proper training and respectful treatment of all visitors to federal facilities. Notably absent from the ceremony was Thompson, the former security guard whose discriminatory behavior had started the entire chain of events. He had been invited but had declined to attend, explaining in a letter to Sarah that while he was proud of her achievement and grateful for the changes that had resulted from the incident, he felt his presence might distract from the celebration of her accomplishments. However, Thompson had continued his work as a diversity trainer and speaker, using his own experience as an example of how unconscious bias could lead to harmful actions. His speaking engagements at federal agencies, corporations, and community organizations had reached thousands of people, and many credited his honest self-reflection with helping them recognize and address their own prejudices. After the formal promotion ceremony concluded, Sarah was surrounded by well-wishers, colleagues, and family members. Her parents had flown in from Texas, beaming with pride at their daughter's achievement. Her younger brother, now a major himself, joked that he would have to salute his sister the next time they met in uniform, but perhaps the most meaningful congratulations came from the dozens of former students who had traveled from around the world to attend the ceremony. These young officers, now serving in leadership positions throughout the military, represented the living legacy of Sarah's commitment to developing the next generation of leaders. "General Martinez," said one former student, now a lieutenant, colonel commanding a battalion in Europe, "your leadership class changed how I think about difficult situations and moral courage. Seeing you promoted to general rank proves that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always the best path forward." As the reception continued, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The discrimination she had faced 5 years earlier could have been a career-ending disaster, a source of bitterness and resentment, or simply a painful memory to be forgotten. Instead, it had become a defining experience that had strengthened her character, enhanced her leadership capabilities, and provided opportunities to make positive changes that extended far beyond her own career. The incident had led to policy changes in federal facilities across the country, improved training for security personnel, and enhanced protections for military personnel facing discrimination. It had also inspired countless service members who had faced similar challenges and demonstrated that adversity could be transformed into opportunity through professionalism, resilience, and moral courage. As the day drew to a close, General Martinez, she was still getting used to the title, stood alone for a moment in the Pentagon courtyard, looking up at the American flag flying overhead. She thought about all the service members who had faced discrimination and prejudice throughout military history, many of whom had not received the support and recognition that she had been fortunate enough to experience. Her promotion to general officer rank was not just a personal achievement. It was proof that the military was becoming more inclusive, more fair, and more committed to recognizing talent regardless of background. But she also knew that the work was far from finished, and that her new rank would provide even greater opportunities to continue advocating for positive change. The security guard who had once mocked her fake military ID and declared that she didn't look like military material had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most inspiring leadership stories in recent military history. The discrimination she had faced had been wrong and painful, but the way she had responded to it, with dignity, professionalism, and a commitment to using her experience to help others, had transformed a moment of prejudice into a lasting example of what true leadership looked like. General Sarah Martinez's story was far from over, But the foundation had been laid for what promised to be a distinguished career at the highest levels of military leadership. The young officer who had been questioned, doubted, and discriminated against was now a general in the United States military, and her journey served as inspiration for anyone who had ever faced adversity and wondered whether they had the strength to overcome it. The answer, as General Martinez had proven, was unequivocally yes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.